So before we can talk about Samuel the individual, we need to sort of back up a second into the book of Judges that comes before, the period just before Samuel and the kingship that Samuel will eventually give rise to set the scene a little bit, because the Judges period was an interesting one in which there was no centralized rule in Israel.
So the impression one gets from the book of Judges is that if there isn't a crisis, everybody goes about their own business.
Yeah.
Then suddenly the Philistines or somebody appear and raid some Israelite village, and they say, we have to get a judge. Now, then this judge comes, he's first of all somebody who wins a battle. A charismatic figure, Samson would be a fine example of somebody, the Spirit of the Lord comes into him and he can pull down houses. Brute force.
Right. But you wouldn't, we call them judges, but they don't really do much judging in the way that we think of.
Most of them don't. And now this will change a little bit with Samuel.
Right. The other thing about the judges is, although the stories sort of frame them as being leading Israel as a whole, they're really much more localized tales, aren't they?
That's right. And in fact, while they are arranged in the book of Judges to give the impression of a sequence, these could have happened in any order. They're really more different localities.
Right. In any order, and in fact, simultaneously, quite possibly.
Yeah.
Right. Individual tribes often will be the ones that are really the focus one at a time. Frequently, Benjamin actually comes up often in the book of Judges. So we have this situation in which there is charismatic, occasional leadership, sort of ad hoc leadership in Israel, and it's working for a time.
Yep.
But something seems to be changing. I think by the end of the book of Judges, we start getting a new nuance, right? We start getting this phrase, right? There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
In their own eyes, yeah. So the Judges is the Wild West of Israelite history. And now in the early chapters of Samuel, you begin to move beyond that. So let's talk a little bit about Samuel himself. We already had in the book of Judges, actually, a few cases of the more or less miraculous birth of the hero. In other words, very often it's because a woman is barren, as in this case, and she goes and prays, and then along comes this special child.
Right.
And that this is a genre that will live on into the New Testament, actually, where remarkable people are born in remarkable ways.
Yeah, and this particular one, right, of course, has a very long prehistory. Goes back to Genesis, right? The previously barren mother, right? Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel, and then Samson's mother, also unnamed, and then Hannah, who gives birth to Samuel after praying, and this very famous and quite full story of her struggles with her rival wife Peninnah, and the praying and sacrificing, and of course the priest Eli thinking that she's drunk when she's praying silently. Yeah. And of course Samuel is born and is sort of given by Hannah to the temple.
So in a way you could say this is what makes Samuel. This is how he comes to be kind of an apprentice at the temple. Now, he isn't in line to become the priest.
Right.
But at the same time, he's in a position of prominence.
Right.
And we do have something that you could even call a call narrative, maybe, where the Lord literally calls to him, and at first he doesn't know what to do about it. You have that already, of course, with Moses as well, but it's something that's very typical of prophets later on.
Right. So this is, I think, the central question for Samuel. He clearly has prophetic capabilities. I mean, he's referred to as a prophet. He's also described as a judge, though perhaps not in the same vein as the previous judges, like Samson. And he also has priestly qualities. He is not a priest, but he is raised in the temple. So he really is, in many ways, a combination of multiple sort of non-monarchic leadership roles.
Yeah. Now, he actually does some judging.
Yes.
And some of the other judges may have done that too, when they had established their credentials. Samuel, though, doesn't have to go out and win a battle to get there.
Right.
but he does seem to be recognized as judge. Now, you say he's also a prophet, and we haven't had prophets much up to this point in the Bible. What would it mean to be a prophet?
Well, it could mean lots of different things. And in fact, this is something that comes up also in the story of Saul to come, right? What kinds of prophets are we talking about? There are sort of ecstatic prophets, the ones who sort of speak in tongues.
There's a famous line about Saul, is Saul also among the prophets?
Right.
And this question is asked because at one point he goes off and meets up with a band of prophets. So you get the impression that these people are roving the countryside like a wild herd. Right. And they're ecstatic, and it says that he strips off his clothes and lies down naked all night, and that impresses people that he must be a prophet.
Right. That seems to be a good thing when it's said about him, right?
So
that
it's a revival meeting.
Yes. I'm not sure Samuel is of that type quite, but there are definitely different, because as opposed to sort of the Elijah, Elisha types that will come later, right, that sort of take messages from God, or at least, speak in God's name, right, which Saul never does. I mean, even when he is, ecstatically prophesying, he's more babbling in tongues, it would seem. Samuel does seem to represent the kind of authority that has been vested by God. And I think that's probably an overlap also with his position as judge.
Now, another thing that Samuel does, another quality that he has, is that he is a seer. And this means that if you lose your donkeys, Samuel is the person to go consult.
Yeah.
And this is one of the lovely things, I think, in this story, that on the one hand you have this figure who is being set up as the highest authority in Israel, but if you lose your donkeys, he's the person you go to.
Yeah, I mean, the seer, the role of seer always has to be an oracular sense to it, right? That you can go and ask a question, and in fact, this is what will happen famously later, even after Samuel is dead, and Saul raises him up to ask him an oracular question, right? This is a quality that Samuel has in life also. He can help you find your donkeys if you go ask him the right questions, with God's help, of course. But Samuel occupies, it seems, a national leadership. But again, the transition from judges to kingship is embodied in Samuel. He's not going to be the king, right? He's going to end up being the king maker.
Yes. And you see, we haven't had kings up to now.
Right.
And for most of the Hebrew Bible, kings and prophets go together.
Yeah.
That, prophecy rises to prominence. I presume there had been prophets before there were kings, but they rise to prophet when they have kings to consult them.
Yeah.
And when they can tell off kings, which is what biblical prophets spend a lot of their time doing.
I mean, this is where Elijah makes his bones, right?
Yeah.
Is doing that, and also Isaiah and many others. Are very much linked to the monarchy.
And with regard to the monarchy, Samuel, I think, will play a double role. That on the one hand, he's the king maker, and then he's also the king breaker. And we'll come to that more maybe in the next session.
Right. But I think what we should talk about here is, as Samuel sort of introduces the concept of kingship in Israel, as the book of Samuel does that, it does so in a sort of in a tentative way. Right? There's a sense in which it's not entirely clear that Samuel, either the book or the prophet, is particularly keen on the notion of kingship.
Yeah, why do they want a king at all?
Right. It seems to me, it seems clear, right? They still, the same reason they wanted a judge, right? There's an external threat that requires facing against.
Yeah.
But more than that, they seem to, the people seem to request a king because everybody else has got one.
Yeah, and in the earlier chapters of Samuel, there are a couple of things that happen. One of which is they lose a battle to the Philistines, and the Philistines capture the ark.
Yeah.
And this is unthinkable, and that sets people thinking we ought to get a king like everybody else,
right,
and be able to deal with a situation like this.
Right. In that sort of case, though, what does the title king really mean? Right. It doesn't. I don't think it means the kind of sort of glorious ruler sitting on a throne, surveying the whole land that we think of when we sort of picture the classic king. It's a little bit more like a glorified judge is what they're asking for, isn't it?
It is indeed, because when Saul becomes king, in one of the first times we see him, he's out plowing. You won't find many kings plowing later
Yeah,
on.
right, the Book of
once they
Kings.
get the hang of the job.
That's right. That's right. But what they really want is just a better judge,
Yeah.
really. They want a judge that can rule.
But at the same time, you do get the sense that there's something new happening here. And let's look for a minute. There's a passage here in chapter 8 that the elders gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. You are old, and your sons don't follow in your ways. Give us a king to govern us. And the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to govern us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them.
Yeah.
Now, the idea that having a human king means you're rejecting the Lord as king, that actually goes against a lot of what you'll find in the Hebrew Bible. But there are two strands and some tension to each other. And then when he agrees to appoint one, he says, these are the ways of the king who will reign over you. He'll take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to run before his chariots. And he'll appoint for himself commanders, and he'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks. He'll take the best of your fields and your vineyards. He'll take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards. How did Samuel know that this is what a king was going to do?
I said he was a prophet, John. So part of this, obviously, is the kind of prophecy after the fact, if you will. This is a book that is clearly written in the period that knows something of what it's like to have a king. In fact, in many ways, Samuel's description of what a bad king will do matches nearly perfectly with what Solomon ends up doing. Yeah. Solomon and some others after him, Jeroboam and some others, in terms of taking land. I mean, the story of Naboth's vineyard and Solomon with all of his wives and his chariots in particular. They knew, right? They knew what was coming, and it's retrojected into Samuel's words as a warning. What's interesting, I think, is the contrast between this and the picture of a king you get in Deuteronomy, right? In Deuteronomy 17, where the law of the king, right?
Yes.
If you're going to have a king, he's got to be, he's going to be very essentially humble, right? He's going to follow the law and not collect wives and not collect horses.
He's going to have a copy of the Bible at his bedside.
That's right. Exactly.
And reading it every night before he goes to sleep.
So we have one strand in 1 Samuel 8 that seems to be very cautious about kingship, at least, is worried about the sort of excesses that come with individual leadership. But you said that there's another strand.
Well, then in chapter 12, when he has agreed to find a king for them, he says, see, here is the king you have chosen. The Lord has set a king over you. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and heed his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But if you will not heed the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you.
Yeah, I have to say, I've always had the impression that one of the reasons that parts of the Bible are sort of cautious about kingship is the worry about having Israel's fate essentially invested in a single person who can do right or wrong.
Yeah.
Right? And this is something that you certainly see play out in the Book of Kings, right? Where a good king is judged well by God and the nation prospers, and a bad king can really, can invoke God's wrath against the whole people. So, the idea of everything being in a single individual, I think, is really the danger.
Now, would you agree that both of these passages are part of the Deuteronomistic edition? Surely, at least the second one is.
Yeah.
Are they in tension with each other?
I'm not sure if they're in tension or
I mean, they're often read as even pointing to two different editions of the books.
I'm not sure. It seems to me that a warning about what kings could do, and at the same time a recognition that, if you listen and obey, it will be okay, is simply sort of representative of reality, right? Kings will do this, but you're going to have them anyway, right? It's sort of it's recognizing the existence of of the office, whatever it's worth.
To jump a little bit ahead of ourselves, the Deuteronomistic edition is done after the fall of Jerusalem, where the main question is, why did this happen to us?
Yeah.
And one of the main answers, at least, is because we, as represented by our kings, did not keep the law.
Yep.
Now, that will require two sides. It also means that if they had kept the law, everything would be fine.
Right.
It probably implies a conditional kingship, I think, and we'll need to talk about that a little bit later, because when David comes to power, it isn't so conditional at all.
That's right. As it is, we are ready to sort of meet Saul, the first king.
Yeah. And when Saul comes on the scene, what is his qualification for kingship?
We will talk about that next time.